Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah,
Get ready because we're heading way back, about 125 million years or so, to the early Cretaceous.
that's right.
And today our focus is on a really fascinating early feathered dinosaur,
Yeah,
Beipiaosaurus.
yeah. It's a good one. And our understanding, it really comes straight from the science, The descriptions, the analyses of the fossils, mostly found in the famous Yixian Formation in China.
Exactly. So our mission today basically is to untack what Beipiaosaurus can tell us about the beginnings of this really odd group, the Therizinosaurs, about how feathers evolved, that whole story, and also just what its world was like back then.
It's a lot packed into one animal.
It really is. Okay, so the story kicks off in 1996. Near Beipiao City, a farmer,
Yeah.
Yixian, finds this partial skeleton. Just wow.
Yeah, an amazing find.
And it took a few years until 1999 for it to be formally described scientifically, and they named it Beipiaosaurus inexpectus. That last part, inexpectus.
Means unexpected in Latin. And it really was.
Unexpected.
Well, mainly because of the feathers. Remember, this was before the discovery of Tyrannus, the huge feathered tyrannosaur. So back then, Beipiaosaurus was actually one of the biggest dinosaurs we had direct fossil proof of having feathers.
Ah, okay. That makes sense. So it was hefty and feathery, which was surprising then.
Exactly. And so far, we know of 3 different specimens that have been reported.
Right. So let's place it on the map, evolutionarily speaking. Where does Beipiaosaurus fit in the grand scheme of dinosaur evolution?
Okay, so big picture. It's a theropod. That's the group with T-Rex, Velociraptor, all those guys. Mostly meat eaters.
Right.
But Beipiaosaurus belongs to a more specific group within theropods called Therizinosaurioidea, and that sits within the even broader Therizinosaura.
Layers within layers.
Kind of, yeah. Think of the Phoratosaurs as the main branch, then Therizinosaura as a twig off that, and Therizinosaurioidea as maybe the base of that twig, with Beipiaosaurus being one of the earliest leaves on it.
Okay, and these Therizinosaurs, they were the weird ones, weren't they? The ones that confused people for a while.
Oh, absolutely. For a long time, scientists weren't quite sure where to put them because they had these features like their teeth and body shape that looked like they were eating plants.
Which is weird for a theropod lineage.
Exactly. Very unlike typical carnivorous theropods. They looked a bit like sauropodomorphs, the long necks, or ornithischians, the bird-hip dinosaurs. So there was a real debate.
So how did they figure it out? How did these plant-eating features show up in a meat-eating line?
Well, Beipiaosaurus was actually crucial here. Because it's considered a very early, very primitive Therizinosauride, its features provided really strong evidence linking all the Rhizinosaurs, even the later super weird ones like Therizinosaurus itself, with those giant claws back to the Coelurosaurian theropods.
Ah, okay. So it solidified their place within the theropod family tree, despite the weird diet.
Precisely. It showed they weren't some offshoot of sauropodomorphs or ornithischians. They were definitely theropods that had just evolved in a very different direction regarding diet. It was a major piece of the puzzle.
So it really helped solve that evolutionary mystery. And where exactly does it sit on the Therizinosauride branch? You said early.
Yeah, phylogenetic analyses, those studies that map out relationships, they consistently put Beipiaosaurus right near the base of the Therizinosauridae tree. Very basal. Some researchers even think it might be the most primitive, most basal one we've found so far.
Wow, okay. Any other dinosaurs thought to be close relatives from that early stage?
Well, there's been discussion about Falcarius. That's another early Therizinosauride, found in North America, actually.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they share some primitive traits, but some studies suggest Falcarius might actually be even more primitive than Beipiaosaurus, so the exact order, who branched off first, it's still something scientists are working on.
Always refining the picture, huh?
Always.
Now, speaking of refining, there was a more recent suggestion, I think from 2024, about another dinosaur from the same area, Yixian.
Yes, that's a really interesting idea. Yixian was found in the same formation, the Yixian, and it also has similar primitive feathers. The suggestion is that maybe, just maybe, Yixian isn't a separate species at all. The idea is that it might actually be a younger Beipiaosaurus, a juvenile or subadult.
So they'd be the same species, just different ages.
Potentially, yes. If that's right, then Yixian becomes what we call a junior synonym of Beipiaosaurus. And the features thought to separate them might just be down to ontogeny changes during growth.
That would definitely tidy things up a bit. Okay, let's picture Beipiaosaurus itself. What did it actually look like? How big was it?
Well, compared to the later, the Lycaosaurs like Signosaurus or the giant Therizinosaurus, it was relatively small.
Right.
Early estimates, based on its thigh bone, its femur, put it around 2.2 meters long. That's about 7.2 feet, and maybe 27 kilos, 60 pounds.
Okay.
But there was a more recent estimate, 2024, by Gregory S. Paul. He suggested maybe a bit shorter, 1.8 meters, so closer to 6 feet, but actually heavier, maybe around 50 kilos or 110 pounds.
So, still a decent size, but definitely not a giant like its later relatives.
No, not in that league.
And what about its neck? You mentioned later ones had really long necks for browsing high up.
Yeah, that's a key difference. Beipiaosaurus had a noticeably shorter neck compared to most of the later Therizinosaurs. It seems that real neck elongation for high browsing came later in the group's evolution. Beipiaosaurus hadn't quite gotten there yet.
More primitive state. What about its feet? Did it have those really distinct four-toed feet that some later ones had?
Not quite. It had a more standard theropod foot, basically 3 main weight-bearing toes, what we call a tridactyl pis.
Okay.
But what's interesting is that the innermost toe, the hallux, was already reduced in size. So it hints at that evolutionary trend towards the four-toed condition that we see fully developed in the later Therizinosaurs.
So you can sort of see the transition happening.
Exactly. It's like catching evolution midway almost. You see these little anatomical shifts starting.
Cool. And the tail. I know some dinosaurs fuse tail vertebrae into a pygostyle, often for supporting tail feathers, like in birds. Did Beipiaosaurus have that?
It did, yes. The last 5 or so tail vertebrae were fused into a pygostyle.
Uh-huh. So maybe it a tail fan.
Well, that's the interesting part. Early analysis suggested that its pygostyle probably wasn't primarily for supporting a big, broad fan of feathers like you see in modern birds or even some other dinosaurs.
So it had the structure, but maybe not for that purpose. Not yet.
Seems like it. The function might have been different initially or perhaps less developed. That specific tail fan function seems to be something that evolved more strongly later or in other groups.
Fascinating. Okay, let's move up to the head. What was its skull like? You said proportionally large.
Yeah, relative to the Therizinosaurs, its skull was quite big for its body size. Unfortunately, the very front bits, the premaxilla and maxilla, the bones forming the upper jaw and snout, they aren't perfectly preserved. So we're missing some detail there. But we know the nasal bone, further back on the snout, didn't have that strong arch across it that you see in many other theropods. Though that could possibly be due to crushing during fossilization. It's hard to say for sure.
Right. Fossilization can do funny things.
Yeah.
What about the top of the skull? The frontals, parietals.
The frontal bone on the skull roof is thought to have been kind of subtriangular and relatively flat, not domed like in some related dinosaurs. And the parietal bones just behind the frontals were large, also flat, and importantly, they were separate bones.
Separate. Not fused.
Right, joined by a suture, but not fused into a single unit like you see in some other Therizinosaurs, another sort of primitive feature.
Gotcha. And the lower jaw, the mandible.
The main bone there, the dentary, which holds the teeth, it was long and quite slender, and actually, proportionally, it was larger compared to the femur than in any other Therizinosaur we know.
Really? Larger jawbone.
Yeah, proportionally. And estimates suggest it might have held more than 37 teeth in each lower jaw.
Wow, that's a lot of teeth for its size. What were they like?
The ones that are preserved look pretty similar to each other in size and shape. We call that homodont. And they were leaf-shaped, pholodont, with little serrations, denticles along the edges.
Leaf-shaped.
Yeah.
Good for plants, presumably.
Seems likely, yeah. Fits with the overall picture of the Rhizinosaurs becoming herbivores or omnivores. It's not totally clear if the teeth right at the very front of the jaw were different, maybe pointier, like in some relatives. We just don't have those preserved well enough.
Okay.
But interestingly, the little denticles, the serrations on the teeth, they were similar in size to those seen on Gigantosaurus teeth.
Ah, another little clue potentially linking those two.
Exactly. Another piece suggesting they might be very closely related or maybe even the same animal at different growth stages.
Right. Okay, quickly, the rest of the backbone. Anything notable about the vertebrae?
The preserved neck vertebrae, the cervicals, they weren't super long, suggesting they're probably from the back of the neck. They had that kind of amphicoelous shape, concave on both ends. Based on relatives, it probably had 9 or 10 neck vertebrae total.
Okay.
Some of the back vertebrae, the dorsals, showed fusion. And a good number of tail vertebrae, the caudals, were found. And notably, they didn't seem to have the internal air spaces, the pneumaticity, that you see in lots of other dinosaurs.
Interesting lack of air sacs there.
Yeah.
Okay, now, the part lots of people find really exciting. The feathers,
Yeah.
we know it had them. What do they actually look like?
Yes. This is where Beipiaosaurus really shines. We have amazing feather impressions from multiple specimens. The first one found, the holotype, it showed these short, slender, sort of filamentous feathers, like simple threads or hairs. They covered much of its left arm and body. They were compared to the feathers on Sinosauropteryx, another famous feathered dinosaur, but the ones on Beipiaosaurus were longer and stuck out more perpendicular to the arm.
So like a fuzzy coat.
Pretty much. At the time, researchers saw these as maybe an intermediate stage in feather evolution, stage 1 or 2.
And the tail had them too.
Yes, the tail also had these filamentous feathers, maybe 4 to 7 centimeters long. But importantly, on that first specimen, there was no sign of broad, veined feathers or a complex tail fan, just the fuzzy filaments.
Okay, but then specimen number 2, STM31-1, revealed something else, right? Something quite different.
Oh, absolutely spectacular. The second specimen showed not just the downy filamentous layer, but also these other structures mixed in, called elongated broad filamentous feathers. EBFFs for short.
EBFFs, what on earth are those?
They're really weird. They're described as a second type of feather growing out from the downy layer. But each EBFF was just a single, unbranched filament, no barbs like a modern feather.
Just a single filament, but you said broad.
Exactly. That's the strange part. They were much longer than the fuzzy down, maybe 10 to 15 centimeters long, like half the neck length and much wider, up to 3 millimeters across.
Wow, like ribbons.
Kind of like stiff ribbons, yeah. They seemed quite stiff, maybe even hollow at the base. They were totally unique when first described. Not just fuzz, but these prominent, broad filaments sticking out.
That's incredible. What would they have been for?
That's the big question. Given their size and stiffness, and the fact they were mixed in with the fuzz, visual display seems like a really strong possibility. Maybe for species recognition or attracting mates.
So feathers doing more than just keeping warm, even this early on.
Seems very likely. It suggests that even these early, structurally simple feathers could have had complex roles.
And were these EBFFs also found on Gianchangosaurus?
Yes. Remarkably, similar structures were also found associated with Gianchangosaurus.
Ah, another strong link.
A very strong link. It really bolsters the idea that these weird feathers were maybe common among these early Therizinosaurs, perhaps for display, and it adds more weight to that potential synonymy idea we talked about.
Right. So you have this image of a dinosaur covered in fuzz, but with these longer, broader, ribbon-like things sticking out too. Quite a look. And we even know something about the color.
We do, which is amazing.
Yeah.
By looking at tiny structures called melanosomes, they're the little packets that hold pigment preserved in the feather impressions from the neck area of one specimen. Scientists were able to infer a likely color, and it came out as brownish, kind of similar to the browns you see in modern reptiles sometimes.
Brown. Okay, and didn't that study also look at the shape of the melanosomes, linking it to metabolism?
Yes, that was another fascinating part. They looked at the diversity of melanosome shapes. The idea being explored is whether melanosome diversity and shape might correlate with physiology, like being warm-blooded, endothermic, versus cold-blooded, ectothermic.
And what did Beipiaosaurus show?
Its melanosomes were less diverse in shape, mostly just spherical, and indicated that brownish color. This was contrasted in the study with some other Maniraptoran dinosaurs and early birds, which seemed to have a greater diversity of melanosome shapes, like rods and spheres, and inferred more vivid colors, and which are often thought to have been potentially warm-blooded.
So the less diverse shapes and brownish color in Beipiaosaurus might hint at a physiology closer to reptiles, or maybe just a less active metabolism than flying birds.
That's the implication, or at least one interpretation being explored. It's complex, but the feather color could be another clue about its biology. It's incredible detail.
Absolutely mind-blowing detail from 125 million years ago. Okay, let's shift slightly to its lifestyle and its world. What about its skin? We have info on that too.
We do. From that same specimen, STM31-1, fossilized skin flakes were preserved.
Skin flakes, like dandruff.
Essentially, yeah. Analysis showed these flakes were made of corneocytes, keratin-rich skin cells, similar to modern birds. But there was a difference. The Beipiaosaurus corneocytes were packed really densely with keratin, but they seemed to lack lipids, fats, within them.
And why is that important?
Well, in modern flying birds, those lipids in the skin cells are thought to help with regulating body temperature and maybe water loss during the demands of flight. The fact that Beipiaosaurus skin cells lacked these lipids
Suggests it wasn't flying.
Exactly. It supports the idea that it was primarily a ground-dwelling animal, not adapted for sustained flight.
Makes sense. And the shedding. Did it shed its skin all in one go like a snake?
No, the evidence from those flakes points the other way. It suggests Beipiaosaurus shed its skin in small flakes, like dandruff, just like modern birds and mammals do.
Ah, another bird-like trait then.
Yep, quite different from the large sheets shed by many reptiles.
Okay, so we have this ground-dwelling, fuzzy, ribbon-feathered, dandruff-shedding dinosaur. What was its world like? The Yixian Formation environment.
Right, so this is early Cretaceous, the Aptian stage, around 125 million years ago. The Yixian environment seems to have had a pretty dynamic climate. There were seasons.
Oh, really?
Yeah, evidence points to warm, humid periods alternating with drier seasons. And interestingly, the average yearly temperature was estimated to be around 10 degrees Celsius, 50 Fahrenheit.
That sounds kind of cool for the age of dinosaurs.
It is, yeah. Relatively cool compared to the typical image of the Mesozoic being universally tropical. Studies suggest things like changes in Earth's orbit, orbital forcing, were driving these climate fluctuations.
So a variable and somewhat chilly place to live, by Mesozoic standards anyway. Maybe those feathers came in handy for insulation after all.
Quite possibly, especially the downy underlayer. Living in that kind of environment might have definitely favored even basic insulation.
And who else was around? Who were its neighbors?
Oh, the Yixian was incredibly diverse, a really rich ecosystem. Other dinosaurs included the early Tyrannosaurid Liaoning, the big feathered Tyrannosaur utyrannus, the little gliding Dromaeosaur, Synonathosaurus, early birds like Confuciusornis.
Yeah.
Lots of famous feathered fossils come from there.
It's a snapshot of that feather evolution explosion.
Absolutely. And beyond dinosaurs, there were ancient shrimp, snails, slugs, tons of insects, fish like Lycoptera. And a lot of the vertebrates actually showed signs of being adapted to living in trees.
An arboreal component, too. What about the plants?
The flora was dominated by conifers, but also lots of ferns, cycads, and horsetails. So forests, lakes, maybe volcanoes nearby, a really complex environment.
A truly amazing window into the past. Okay, let's try and wrap this up. If we boil it down, what are the really key things Beipiaosaurus tells us?
Well, I think, first, it's crucial for understanding early Therizinosaur evolution. It really helped lock them into the theropod family tree, showing that weird path towards herbivory.
Right.
Second, the feathers are huge, both the simple filamentous type and especially those unique EBFFs. They show us that early feather evolution wasn't just a simple linear path towards flight feathers. There was experimentation, possibly for display, even early on.
Yeah, those EBFFs are wild.
Then there's the biology, the brownish color, the skin structure, lacking lipids, the dandruff-like shedding, all giving us clues about its physiology and confirming that ground-dwelling lifestyle.
Uh-huh.
And finally, placing it in that cool, seasonal Yixian environment helps us understand the context it lived in. Oh, and that ongoing question about giant Tangosaurus. It just shows how science keeps refining our understanding as new evidence comes up.
Absolutely. It's a living field of study.
Yeah.
Okay, great summary. So for our listeners, here's a final thought to chew on. Thinking about those really weird EDFS and their likely role in display, what other jobs might early, simple-looking feathers have done before flight became a thing? And how could that specific Yixian environment, the cooler climate, the seasons have pushed the evolution of feathers and maybe even their colors in dinosaurs like Beipiaosaurus?
Lots to think about there.
Definitely something to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.